you guys got quiet really fast because I wanted to do that again. Thank you. That was quite fast and efficient. We don't normally do this, so this is our new innovative piece to this event, and I'm really excited to do it for the first time. So I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. Hello again, everyone, and please join me in welcoming our webcast viewers. My name is Khadija Wasim, Director of the Canadian Club of Toronto and your host. Viewers, thank you for joining us. Our club embraces the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Our commitment is reflected not only in the wide variety of topics and issues that we address, but in the diversity of the speakers who appear at our podium. Today's event is a wonderful example of just that. We would not be able to offer such a high-quality programming without the support of our event sponsors, and today we're grateful for the support of PwC, represented here by Akif Siddiqui. Thank you so much for your generosity. Now, time to hear from our panelists. Climbing the corporate ladder can be challenging. Layer that challenge with the fact that visibly different employees are often found at the bottom of the ladder and not at the top. It's openly acknowledged that there are many challenges to thriving in the corporate world. Sadly, being a person of color is often not one of them. The lived experiences of our panelists will illuminate the challenges. Let's hear from them now. Faithe Holder is a partner in the real estate and financial services in the Gowling WLG's Toronto office. She's been recognized as one of the best lawyers in Canada for project finance law. She's actively involved in the diversity and inclusion initiatives at Gowling. Saima Malik is currently AVP Omni Capabilities, which focuses on the connected experiences for TD customers and employees. She leads TD's Women in Leadership pillar for digital tech and also supports MATS Women, an initiative that cultivates leadership for Muslim women. Soli leads Deloitte Canada's security and justice practice to help modernize and optimize Canada's safety, security, and justice agencies. He's a trusted C-suite advisor and a global thought leader on security and justice issues. Previously, Peter was a deputy chief in the Toronto Police Services. Akif Siddiqui leads PwC's insurance audit practice. He brings diversified experience from 21 years working in assurance and advisory services in Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, and Canada. His community work includes being the executive sponsor for PwC's South Asian Business Network and serving as president of the Pakistani Professional Forum. Today's discussion is moderated by Ginella Massa. 4 years ago, Ginella made headlines for her head covering, for her hijab. She's Canada's first hijab-wearing television news reporter and anchor. She has worked behind the scenes and on air for local and national Canadian news outlets, including CTV, News Talk, 1010, and Rogers TV. She's currently the 11 p.m. weeknight anchor for Toronto's City News. Audience, don't forget, if you have questions for our panel, please don't forget to use the Q&A cards that are on the table, and volunteers will be around to connect them. And now, I'm pleased to turn the Canadian Club of Toronto's podium over to Ms. Massa and our panelists.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Khadija, and thank you so much to everybody for being here. I was really excited to be asked to be a part of this event. I think it's such an important conversation. One, to celebrate some of the achievements that some of these folks have achieved, and many of you in the room as well, but also to have a candid discussion about some of the work that still needs to be done moving forward to make our workplaces more inclusive. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to my panelists. I want to start maybe by asking, well, let me ask this. Let me do a poll. How many of you have walked into a room in a work setting where you were the only person of color?
It'd be interesting to ask the audience.
Yeah, let me ask you. That's a good question. That's a good point, Saima. Let me ask the audience as well. How many of you have walked into a room where you're the only person of color? So maybe for some of your colleagues, to think about that, to walk into a room where no one looks like you, no one has had the same experiences as you. I do want to start on a positive, though, because I want to ask maybe, what are some of the successful things that you've seen done that has really made you feel like this workplace or this company is really thinking about folks like me and our experiences, and I would like some others to take a cue from that? I know maybe Akif, we had talked about this earlier. Maybe you want to.
Yeah, well, like it's interesting to look back 17 years ago when I initially came here, and I used to share that with most of my friends that on the entire floor there was only 2 people who would look like me, and it was challenging at times where immigrating and coming to learning a new language where you are speaking. And you try to feel that, okay, there is somebody else whom you can deal with. And now, fast forward 17 years, we are on the Bay Street, and we are here in downtown with so many different people with different diversity, and that's what has changed. So similarly, I think PwC has evolved, and I feel very proud to work with PwC because what we have done over the years is that we have embraced those differences, and we have created what we call our employee resource group, which not only include the South Asian Business Network, but like I think we were the first to have a gay, lesbian, and everyone else employee resource group within the organization. We have a very strong Latino network, and we have a very strong Black woman network. And we don't try to make those resource group as not only to motivate our employees, but we are also using it to bring them back to the business which we are doing. And that's what I say, like embracing those differences, using those differences and including those people into our core business activities. And that's how we are making those changes, and I feel very comfortable now that after 17 years, we can walk around in downtown and don't feel aliens.
Yeah. Faithe, I'll ask you to answer that question.
Sure. I think for me, one of the things that's really been quite impressive in terms of the steps that my firm has taken in making diversity and inclusion a core part of our value and our culture are the things that are being done at the firm that involve absolutely everybody, that require resources, that require time. When you think about it from a business perspective, one of the most difficult things to do is to take, half a day, a whole day, out of everybody's day. You look at dollars and cents and you think, wow, that adds up very quickly. But our firm has a mandate of ensuring that absolutely everyone in the firm, not just in our Toronto office, but across Canada, gets trained in unconscious bias. And so we have gone through every assistant, every clerk, every lawyer, every student, and put the time and the money into ensuring that everybody has that training. And I've been very impressed with that because of the commitment that's required. On top of that, I was just mentioning to someone recently that another thing that the firm has done is ensure that absolutely everybody at the firm, we've created a respect in the workplace policy that takes into consideration a number of heads of diversity and has a premise that deals with inclusion as well. But we've then taken 3 hours out of everyone's day to ensure that people, and again, this is everyone in the firm, goes through training on our diversity and inclusion and respect in the workplace policy. And so for me, you can have individuals at the head of an organization getting trained on these things. You can pay lip service to it, but if you want it to be part of your culture and you want it to be embedded in what the firm represents, it has to touch absolutely everyone. And I've just been really grateful that my firm is willing to put the resources, time, energy into making sure that it does touch everyone.
I'm glad that you brought up unconscious bias, because I don't know if everyone necessarily knows what that means. Can we talk a little bit about, maybe some folks have had personal experiences with maybe dealing with microaggressions or dealing with stereotype or dealing with assumptions about you because of your race? Maybe Saima or Peter, do you have anything to share about that?
I think similar to Akif's, when I started, I know 20 years ago, I was definitely the only woman in color in tech. It was a new space for me. I think for me in particular, there was a lot of the concept of covering. So I'm a first-generation immigrant. I didn't really talk a lot about my history and my culture. I often said, I'm born in Ottawa. I'm as Canadian as you can get. I didn't talk about my religion very often because it's very uncomfortable if you don't drink or you're fasting during Ramadan. And then I actually didn't talk a lot about being a mom at the same time because I had 3 kids, and really that doesn't represent the leadership traits that people were looking for. And so for me, my history and journey has been around uncovering, and TD was the first place that it made all of those elements of my life okay to share more. When we think about unconscious bias, I think the myth maybe people don't realize everybody comes with an unconscious bias. Just because I'm a woman of color doesn't mean I have my own unconscious bias that I have to unravel. And what we've done a little bit differently at TD, not only have we done all the great things that you need to do, the training, all that great stuff, but we have made it more comfortable at our leadership level to talk about these things and ask the questions. So for the individuals, specifically the leaders, asking the questions and making it a safe space to ask that question. Why aren't we hiring more? Why don't we have more Black candidates? Why don't we have more women in the pipeline? Do we feel comfortable with the amount of visible minority representation within our talent pools and our leaders? And we're actively working. So I think for unconscious bias, there's definitely that, but you have to create those safe spaces where people can overcome the unconscious bias and they can understand how they need to behave and what the next step is. And the easiest thing is just to ask the question. Let's not go around it. Just ask the question. Someone will answer it.
Peter, I'm going to direct my next question to you just because you haven't had a chance to speak yet. And I'm going to go back to my first question, which is about being the only person of color in the room or walking into a room where you're the only person who looks like you. Peter, what's that like? Have you been in that situation?
I was blessed with 2 different careers and 2 similar but different experiences in that. In policing, I was blessed with a group of forerunners who, quite frankly, broke through most of the glass ceilings before I needed to. I might have cleared out some shards, but I didn't have to actually do the first breakthrough. So people like Keith Ford in the Toronto Police Service, who's a friend and a mentor. Coming into Deloitte, I will tell you very explicitly, my fear, having personally suffered and seen how others suffered in policing around bias and outright discrimination, both inside the organization and how that was delivered into the community, I didn't want a similar experience. And so I was recruited heavily when I was transitioning. I will tell you the single factor that determined that Deloitte would be where I would go was when I met with their CEO and their chief talent officer, and I heard straight from them what their vision was and how they actually operationalized their diversity and inclusion strategy. It was at that point I knew Deloitte was the right organization for me to come in. That said, of 1,100 partners in 2016, only 1 was Black at the time. Now, we doubled it with me, and then we doubled it again, and we've doubled it again. So where the trajectory is going in the right direction with that doubling formula, in relatively short period of time, we're going to take over the place.
Slowly, but surely.
No pun intended with slowly. But it's more than, and I'll tell you where the bias does creep in, because if you speak about or advocate for your particular demographic, whether you're a woman or you're Muslim or you're Black, you can be tainted or targeted with, well, you're only looking after your own, therefore you're not part of the true corporate goals. And certainly that was an accusation laid against me in my previous career. What I want to see in my organization, Deloitte, and in all organizations is, okay, I can advocate for what I feel is an unfair set of circumstances that personally affects me because I want to bring all of me to the workplace. But I also want to know that I can join in other advocacy efforts and that as an organization we advance it. So as much as I can see advancement around the issue of Blacks within my organization, I can see it around women and the LGBTQ community. I can see it across the board, and the messages are from the very height of the organization. We've just announced our new Canadian partner, leader for risk advisory, Poonam Singh, and she is convened in the area of cyber. We're the least diverse of our business lines and have the least amount of women, and she had a powerful message to us that ended in literally her shedding tears, but the level of authenticity and the forcefulness of her leadership sent a clear signal about the direction we're going. And groupthink is not the way for us to be successful going forward. And so a diversity of thoughts and a diversity of teams will allow us to provide a higher quality to our clients.
So you kind of answered the next question, which I was going to ask, is something that you touched on, which is, I want to ask you folks, how do you avoid or how do you navigate bringing up these issues with your employer, whether it's an issue in the workplace that you've dealt with, a culture issue, whether it's an issue of hiring and inclusivity, and not being labeled that person? oh, it's always about race. Oh, here we go again with this. Oh, I don't see color, right? How often have we heard that? How do you navigate that? And what's the pitch that you make to say why it's important for a company to think about this in this way?
So if I can add, I can take a lead, and basically the way I think we as a partnership and we as an organization are looking at it is that we are a service organization industry. We have to work with people. Now, we don't have to just work with white men. We have to work with the broader communities. And if we are not reflective of that community and that diaspora, then we would not be able to do those businesses. And that's coming right from the top and right from the inherent commercial sense, and that's why it's easier to embrace those differences. And that's why we are trying to build up more diverse and inclusive conversations. Now, there's always the time when it talks about partner admission or hiring of senior resources where, that person doesn't, it would be difficult for me to work with them because he doesn't feel like them. And that's where most of our conversation is stopped and say, that's exactly the unconscious bias which we need to think about, because we don't want two of you in the room. We want two diverse discussions in that. And that's where we keep, as a partnership group, we are trying to enforce that in the within the organizations and going through that.
Oh, Saima?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is, if you're afforded the resources, monitoring and measuring really helps, because coming to the table with data, talking about what your pipeline looks like, how many women, how many vismen in there, it's representative, it's actual solid data that talks about what you're trying to do. To Akif's point, there's an economic imperative, obviously, just to do the right thing. You want to represent the communities you serve. So I think those are two pieces. Sometimes you do have to be that person, unfortunately. Sometimes you do have to be that person who's going to call out that something isn't happening. So, if you are afforded to be in a leadership position, you can call out some of those things as you're going through the talent pipeline or candidates, and you see that. So there have been instances at TD specifically where we've looked at the candidate pool and the leaders have said, hey, they're all sort of one type. Go back and get a more diverse candidate pool and come back. But we have to do more of that, and that requires leaders to be much more courageous, and they have to get over being that person. But there needs to be more of that happening more often at the leadership table.
Faith, you were nodding.
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree with what both of you have said. And the reality is, in my experience, I don't think there's a cookie cutter approach that can be taken. There are different things that will resonate, different approaches that will resonate with different people within your context, right? So for some people, the business case is actually quite persuasive, right? Because that's what drives their thinking, their approach to life, et cetera. For other people, it is a value statement. So it's the right thing to do, and perhaps you're the person who may point out something that they may not have realized, but once they see it, they take it on as something that they can take ownership over. So I think, and there's a spectrum, so it varies, and I think you have to be on so that when a situation arises, you're in a position to say, okay, how am I gonna approach this? Is it gonna be this end of the spectrum, that? I have 10 people in this room and they're all different, they're all diverse. There are going to be different things that will speak to each of them. And so there is this being on, but to your point, Saima, about courage, that's really, in my experience, what it's taken. There are times when you're in a room and an opportunity arises and you have a split-second choice to make. Do I speak up? Do I risk being labeled, who knows what, including, yep, there's the race card again, or whatever the case may be, or do I put it on the table and hope that this is a teaching opportunity, a learning opportunity? I've been fortunate in my setting that I haven't had to think about it necessarily from a courage perspective, because the door has been pretty open. And I not only do I view that as fortunate, but it's actually, I think in some ways quite unique. So the door has been pretty open, and I've been given an opportunity to express my views. And so I've been able to share a lot of those thoughts, but I know not everybody has that setting and that opportunity. And so, yeah, courage, I think, is a really key thing to sort of focus on when you're in that setting, because it requires you to step out on a limb and you don't know what the outcome will be.
And just to add on to that, it's and again, as I work with a lot of new immigrants and with Pakistani professionals, I try to like in terms of mentoring, it is internal shyness and internal biases which holds us back at times as well. If I go back to my early years, I would never admit that I don't drink because of the religion. I would always say, oh, I don't drink because of my preference. Or the first 2 or 3 years of our employee surveys, I never identified myself as a visible minority because I didn't know how that would be related to. Now, those are my internal fears and shyness. Yes, the broader canvas has changed and it is much more easier to be have that courage, but we need to get out of our internal biases as well to get to that level of courage to speak out and stand for your own self.
Can I add just one thing? And that is, we are all intertwined here. Whether you want to think of it as 6 degrees of separation or whatever, we're living in a society together. And there are ways in which we influence each other that we don't even necessarily realize. So in my sphere, in a law firm setting, and I can speak for mine and many others, one of the things that I know has been a driving force for a lot of law firms in Toronto, or a lot of law firms in Canada, quite frankly, is that a lot of their clients have valued diversity and inclusion. A lot of the banks have valued diversity and inclusion and have said to them, this is something we value. You are our service provider. Show us what you are doing in this sphere. And we are impacting each other because the firms then say, this is important to our clients, the banks, or fill in the blank, whatever other corporate entity. And so we're going to do something about this. And I'm not saying that that's the only driving force, but don't lose sight if you're in the audience or, and you are from a private entity, a corporation, a bank, whatever the case may be, don't lose sight of the power that you have to drive behaviors within your service providers as well. I think it's really important to keep that in mind.
I want to ask, I'm sure there are a lot of managers in the room, people who are involved with hiring, and we talked a little bit about hiring, but I think that hiring diverse talent is only one piece of the puzzle, right? We want to also make sure we're retaining that talent and making sure that the environment that they're coming into is one that they feel welcomed in. Can you guys speak a little bit to that about how do we make sure that those hires aren't just symbolic, that we're not just checking a box, and ensuring that the workplace culture actually is one that retains that talent? Peter, do you want to?
I won't speak about Deloitte because I haven't been there long enough to know the recruiting piece. I'll refer to my previous experience, but I think there's lessons learned. So in my tenure at Toronto, we actually went from an average of 24% women and visible minorities in a typical intake class up to 56, 55%, and we maintained that for almost a decade after. And that jump took place in less than one year. So it's a difficult hiring process. I would suggest to you, anyone that's struggling with getting to a level of greater representation, if you put the will and the skill and you bring the data to bear, you can very quickly advance that. To your point about retention, where we found that system let down was as soon as we assigned our officers into a coach-officer relationship, that was where the culture really smacked into them. And without proper supports around the coach officer and the recruit, very quickly that very valuable, diverse, inclusive asset was degraded significantly, and we never ever regrouped from that. I know I heard a stat recently in Deloitte, and I'm sure other big corporations are finding the turnaround of young people is very, very quick. And so what I used to think would be like maybe a 5-year, 6-year piece is now almost less than 2 years. And a lot of that is the opportunities in the market, and a lot of that is how well we are treating and retaining our people. I'd be very interested to see if we had data around exit interviews. What are the reasons why you left? And inevitably there's a multiplicity of reasons. But if any one of them or a trend line relates to how they felt, how included they felt, how their diverse talents that they were recruited for were actually utilized once they came in, then that would be a data point that I would think would need a lot of focus on to figure out what went wrong and how we can make it better.
Faith, I think we had talked about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I think about the retention question, I often think about the inclusion component of diversity and inclusion, and I think that's really where it sits. So, diversity is inviting someone to the dance, and inclusion is actually picking them up and having them dance with you, engage with you. And for me, it really is about making somebody feel like they are wanted, they are respected, they are needed, they are their authentic self and able to be their authentic self when they are within the firm, the corporation, whatever the setting may be. And so I think I can speak for my own experience in terms of what has enabled me to remain at our firm for 18 years, long time. You know, and that is that I've actually had people pay attention to me as an individual and champion, not just mentor, not just pay lip service to my well-being, my development as a lawyer and as a person, but champion my cause and support me throughout the process, and enabled me to be forward-thinking about next steps and about setting goals, et cetera. And I think it may sound like a very involved process, it may sound like a lot of work, but we do that inherently for a lot of people in our setting, and I think we need to start filtering that kind of behavior through D&I related lenses to make sure that we're doing it for everybody. And I think that's what, if you're feeling, this may sound like a bit of a generalization, but if you're feeling like you are included, respected, and you can be you in that setting, chances are it's less likely that you're going to want to leave.
I'm going to let you answer that question, but you brought up such an important point, and Saima, you talked about this, being able to be your authentic self. I'm sure a lot of people in this room can relate to what you said about feeling like I can't talk about the fact that maybe I'm Muslim, I don't drink, I have kids, I'm coming to work and I'm whitewashing myself, essentially, to fit into this atmosphere. And every day I'm putting on this mask, or every day I'm having to be somebody that I'm not in order to fit in. And that's exhausting, right?
Yeah, there's an extreme amount of pressure, like you mentioned, coming to work and not bringing your whole self. And so, you know, I talked about my journey as when I came to TD was the first time I felt like I could actually be my full self. All of it, representing all of it. And I think that's one of the reasons, first of all, that's one of the reasons I'm still at TD. I not only get to do that, but one of the other reasons that TD does really, really well is employee engagement in serving the communities that are representative of the communities that they have employees with, and the advocacy or work that they want to do outside. Employees are then encouraged to participate as part of those communities, whether it's the South Asian Council where there's members of, or work that's being done in the Black experience, or the LGBTQ community. So I think that's something that makes that employee feel 100% that they get to come to work every day, they get to talk about who they are as a full, authentic self, and they get to participate in the communities that help represent them. And so I think those employee circles help retain those employees and gives them a bigger purpose when they think about their job. And it helps just continue to progress the sense of diversity and inclusion. So I think they're really important parts of that diversity and inclusion around the communities you engage with, serve with, and your employee base, and what communities they're a part of also.
We talked about having to be that person in the room. How many of you have had to take on the role of diversity trainer, workshop facilitator, de facto, to say, this thing that's happening here, this is problematic, and we need to have a conversation about it? And have you had that moment where you're like, oh God, now it's on me to do this, right? I know I've been there, and it sucks sometimes to say, I just want to go to work and just do my job and not have to do that. Have you had to do that? Not Faith's nodding. Peter's nodding. Everyone's nodding. Peter?
I remember speaking to the head of our national public sector. 6 months at Deloitte, I think I was on 6 different D&I panels. Michael was one of them. And at some point I said, look, I'm pretty sure you didn't hire me just to be, the latest flavor of D&I. Although it was a deciding factor for me to come, I have a lot of learning I need to do. I don't want to say that in any disingenuous way, because some of those early conversations led to some of the changes I talked about before. There's certainly times within my broader career where, because you were the one with the lived experience, you were asked to lead a particular initiative. And I understand that, particularly if there's a scarcity of diversity, no doubt you're going to be asked to take on leadership. And folks in the room, that is part of your contribution to your corporate environment. So step up. Whether you volunteer or whether you've been tapped on the shoulder, step up. There are other times where I, against the advice of anybody that knew anything about advancing your career, I said, I want to volunteer to do this thing. And in fact, the reason why I'm with Deloitte is because I volunteered to do something in my previous profession and took on an issue that was vexing and complex and was an Achilles heel to my organization and to policing broadly. At the end of the day, I thought I was at the right time in my career to take on a challenge of this size, and I could suffer the consequences, good or bad. And so that's an element of courage. It is an element of discernment that comes from wisdom and experience. And sometimes, quite frankly, a bit of naivete to believe that you can actually take on a challenge like that. But nothing gets done without a combination of those three things.
And similar, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Similar to that, like training is one part, training or facilitation is one part of it. I think as an executive and sponsor for our South Asian Business Network, which is growing, like bringing that South Asian culture to the wider group where people can see those differences helps them to embrace those differences and then identify those things. Like there are lots of times where the question arises about very small things which are normal to the South Asian community. And then say, for example, having an event during the month of Ramadan where half of the population is fasting. So if you are planning an event during those times, most of the population, the people would not come. And those things, just helping people to understand those things in a broader setup,
The cultural
makes it
sensitivity
easier.
piece, yeah.
Make it easy. And those are the very small things which, oh yeah, that's the reason why you cannot do it and why Ramadan keeps on moving on different times of the year. And those are the things which makes it easier to provide that courage to have the discussions.
Here's a great public service announcement. Ramadan starts next weekend.
Yes.
Thursday. Don't plan
Next
any
Monday.
important lunches if you have Muslim staff. Sorry, Faith, you were going to...
Yeah, I think it was sort of a springboard off of what Peter was saying and also yourself. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the ways I think about our involvement, and each of us have been involved in various capacities in our organizations, pushing the dial when it comes to D&I. One of the ways I think about that involvement is it's necessary work in many ways and necessary involvement to get to a stage where you are not the only one, putting in the time, doing the training, et cetera, right? So for me, when I think about it, I'm like, yes, maybe now I have to be one of 2 or one of 5 or one of however many, but if we do the work and we put in the time and we, yes, slug it out with the training, et cetera, the hope is that you get to a point where there's a multitude, quite frankly, and maybe you get to a point where you don't need the training, but there's a multitude of people who are doing it then. So it's an investment of some sort.
At the risk of pulling this topic too long, it bears obvious mention. I don't think any one of us would have the courage or the ability to do the things we've talked about unless there were, within that established cohort within the organization, leaders who are willing to provide us a space, to open the door, to speak out even more courageously, to start the conversation around which we could follow up on. And almost in every one of the occasions where I felt brave enough to do that, it was because a senior officer or a senior partner had created the space around which, and I'll be honest, a male white senior officer or senior partner had created enough space and support to allow that to happen. So when you talked about we're all in this together, no one advances their individual cause unless we all, to some degree, work more together than against each other.
So by that token, because we are almost out of time, I'm going to try and squeeze 2 questions in. One is, there are lots of people in the room here who came to this event, who want to hear, who want to learn more. How can we do better? How can we help you? How can I be an ally? What is your advice to your white, male colleagues, straight, able-bodied colleagues, the managers who are here, who want to do better but don't know how, your colleagues who want to support you, or what is your advice to them? And maybe we can kind of go down the line. Oh, Saima, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say the first thing I talked about a little bit, ask questions and have the courage to ask the questions. So I think, for many of you, you may have been doing what you're doing for a very long time, and you actually may not realize you might be doing something wrong or a behavior that you have is not appropriate. I think the first thing is, turn to one of your colleagues, your peers, and ask the question and have the courage to ask the question. Because I
think maybe to that, be open to hearing the answer.
Be open to hearing the answer. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think that's the most important because it's the dialogue that is the most important piece of that. And just that alone to that person that you're asking is going to be that bridge that they're looking for. And maybe there's someone who's more junior or someone who's still doing a lot of covering up, and they're just looking for that bridge to build that stronger relationship with you, because in the end, it's actually all about relationships, and it's a great way to start that conversation.
Can I actually jump in on that? To your point about being open to asking questions or recognizing maybe that a behavior is problematic. I had a colleague who said to me, a colleague came, she's black, and a white woman came to apologize to her about something that had happened, and the white woman was crying. And my friend said to her, please don't put me in a position where I have to comfort you for something that you've done to me, right? If you're apologizing to me, please be open to hearing what you've done wrong and how you can do better. This is not about me making you feel better for something that you've done wrong, right? Sorry, so let's continue down the line there.
Yeah, so I would add, I totally agree with asking that question and listening to the answer, but also, what I would add is providing that safe environment where people are not feeling shy about, people of color, people who are any person who is not being welcomed in the room, they are already intimidated. Providing that atmosphere and the culture where they can openly talk about those differences, that atmosphere is very critical, and that can only be done by those people who are majority in that room. And these are very small things which you can do, you can think about, and it's not rocket science, and especially where in a business setup where we are only trying to work around the relationship, this is part of the relationship. You want to get that trust from them and provide that safe environment.
And so I agree with what both of the other speakers have said. I think I would add to that to stay the course. Because this is not, snap your finger and all of a sudden we have an environment that is completely diverse and completely inclusive and all goes well overnight. This is sustained hard work that takes time. It took a long time to ingrain our culture with some of the biases and prejudices and stereotypes and what have you that is part of our culture right now. And so it's going to take some time to undo a lot of that. And so I think, there may be a sense of longevity within some of the people who are doing the work, but you need allies who are going to stand by you throughout the entire process. And I'm not necessarily saying that there's an end result, like an end of the game or end of the process.
Racism's over.
It's a journey. It's a journey, and it's going to take time. We need people to stand by us, throughout the entire journey. So sustained and sort of long-term commitment to the process.
I'm gonna make a part B to this question before you answer, but it's just an extension. It just was reminded of a conversation we were having at the table about a white colleague saying that he feels guilty, and he wants to do better, but he feels guilty and he doesn't know what to do. And we had said, well, guilt isn't a productive feeling, right? How can you kind of speak to that a little bit? And
well, now you've thrown a curveball at me. So, let me try. So my two pieces of advice is know yourself, and that may touch on the feel guilty piece. I remember I actually led a D&I strategy within the Toronto Police Service, and we exposed our senior command and some of our key people around intercultural competency. And it's an assessment tool that allows you to see where you are on a scale of personal development and then where the organization is as well, and you can sort of close the delta. I went into it, and I was actually the first person to volunteer to take the tool. And the results that came back were, Peter, you've got some challenges around your own ability to act in an interculturally competent way. You've got biases and blind spots. And so first I had to know myself and confront myself, because we all have biases. When you can do that, I think you can act more responsibly, authentically, and more effectively when you do the second part, which is don't ask permission, do the right thing. So if you need to intervene in a conversation, if you need to take on a leadership role within that area, at least you're coming from the most true self, and you're more likely to be successful. It's one thing to call out the organization around a bias or one of the isms, but if you're harboring those same things, if you're part of a different problem, then it's harder to be a leader on that issue. Guilt will come when you realize that you have not been your best version of yourself. And so whether you admit it and it has to be negotiated in some way, or whether you just deal with it so that you can move on from it. But that is, we're all going to be confronted with that sense of guilt. I wish I'd known this back then, or I wish I had handled that situation differently. Whether
So
you
what are you
choose to
going to do
express it.
now?
Well, so do something with it, learn from it, grow from it, and move forward.
Yeah, I think the question around guilt was like guilt around recognizing, maybe I have white privilege and I can't change that and I feel guilty about it, right? And so I think to me, my response was, well, you can't change who you are, but you can change what you do with it, what you do with that privilege and how you change the environment around you. We're almost out of time. I want to go to this question. Someone asked, do buzzwords like diversity and inclusion get in the way sometimes of tangible action when we use these terms? I mean, this is the first time I heard it specifically as D&I, because it is, a very specific box that we're trying to check sometimes. We only have a few minutes, so quick answer.
I think from my perspective, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time doing is at the start of a conversation, making sure that we're all on even keel in terms of the definitions of the terms we're using. Because yes, they can get in the way. If you think you're having a conversation and you're using the word diversity or you're using the word inclusion and you're defining it one way and someone else is thinking of it a completely different way, you're not really going anywhere in that conversation. And so in our process, within our firm setting, one of the things we've done is ensure that in all our trainings and what have you, we make sure we lay a common ground in terms of, and get to a common understanding in terms of what these terms mean, and then we can have a conversation with them without using those terms, without those terms getting in the way, but being productive.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, and this is really just the beginning of a conversation. I want to thank you all for being so candid with us and sharing your experiences, because it is a brave thing to do often, especially when you are one of only two, in a room, and you're having to take on that role. So I want folks to think about that as they head back to their workplaces this afternoon, and hopefully continue these conversations and allow this be a moment to open the door to be really candid and vulnerable about how we can make our workplaces more inclusive. Thank you so much to the panel, and thank you all for being here.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Bach, and I'm very proud to be a board member of the Canadian Club of Toronto. And I, like Khadija, am pretty excited, although at my age, we just stand still for obvious reasons. This was Khadija's idea, and I had the distinct pleasure of helping make it happen. Not because it's the right thing to do. I'm really not that good a person. But because this is what the city of Toronto looks like. And this was such an important conversation for us to have. It's the first time in the 120-year history of this club that we have had a conversation about the impact of race and ethnicity in employment. Yeah. Faithe, Saima, Peter, and Akif, I want to thank you for being here and for sharing your stories. You're leaders within your organizations, and you're exceptional, and I'm so hopeful for what the future holds for our city and our country because of people like you and the impact that you can have. There were so many things that you mentioned that really resonate with me. Saima, the last one that I was thinking about was have the courage to ask questions and be open to hearing the answer. And I think that's such an important message. One of my colleagues on the board, and I'm not going to point him out, John, well, you're the fool who showed up, dude. But when, in the conversation about this event was like, as a white person, am I okay to come to this? And I said, absolutely. The brown people, they don't need this message. And it's so important as an education piece for folks that look like me to shut up and listen and ask questions and create space and understand that the lived experience of people that don't look like me can be very different. So thank you all for sharing that. I also want to thank Ginella for being here. I have a tiny little gay boy crush on Ginella. Because I'm the gay boy, she's not, just to be clear. When Ginella became the first hijabi-wearing anchor on CityTV, I was so excited. She's no longer the first in Canada. There are apparently 2 others. They're not as good, let's call it. One's in Quebec, one's in Saskatchewan. They're not even places, really. But it's so important that CityTV has you, and I'm so glad that you could be on this podium, and I really hope to see more of you on this podium. I also want to thank all of you for being here. Some of you, this is a first time coming to a Canadian Club event. I am actually leaving the board in a few months, and we've done a lot of work in the past 6 years to make sure that we have a club that is relevant to today's city. And I would encourage you to learn more about the club, to get on our mailing list, and to attend more events. Speaking of events, May 3rd, we have Premier-elect Jason Kenney coming to a club, maybe a different audience. Just going to put that out there. Tuesday, May 7th, we also have the Toronto Star's Washington Bureau Chief Daniel Dale will be here to talk about fact-checking the U.S. president. That seems like a busy job. And then Thursday, May 9th, we'll host a panel to discuss Canadian leadership on medical cannabis research. So I hope that you'll be able to attend. I also want to thank our sponsor, PwC. Thank you so much. Without you, we could not make these events happen. And thank you to MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for live streaming today's event. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I hope to see you at an event very soon. Thank you.